Great. So with that, I think I will just let everybody know a little bit about this series. So this series is called the Graduate Student Research Series. And we launched the series last year. And basically, this is a way for us to showcase AU graduate students around the campus and the research that they're doing. And so this is a great opportunity we find for the AU community to come together and other graduate students to come together and talk about research and highlight some of our grad students. So today we are pleased to announce that our grad student is Mary Ann Parker, and Mary Ann Parker is the current president right now for AGSA, and she also is nearing completion of her Master's of Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies here very soon, I anticipate. She's an artist, an art instructor, and end-of-life doula practitioner and instructor. She currently lives with her husband and elderly parents and various children, depending on the week, and grandchild. And they live together in a variety of unfinished art and writing projects. So thank you very much, Mary Ann, for joining us and for being here today. And I think I have granted you presenter rights. So whenever you are ready, Mary Ann, you can take it away and share your presentation.
Yep. Sounds good. I'll just click on it here. There may be a bit of a delay. All right. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come and listen to my presentation this afternoon. Very much appreciated, because I know we all have busy lives these days. But yes, the introduction that Crystal so graciously gave is very true. I think I'm doing my own lived experience study. We have just moved my family in September into one joint living experiment. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today, I've been witnessing firsthand, but it's become a huge part of my life. And so let me walk you through it. So, and please feel free to raise your hand. I think Crystal will keep an eye just in case I miss anything, but if I can, I will definitely call on you to jump in. Yeah. So this is a phenomenological study of the death doula. So this is me. So yeah, finally, hopefully near the end, although there's part of me that doesn't want to end this, because the last year and a half has really caused a lot of growth in me and my understanding of my own being in the world, as Heidegger would say. So I am also an end of life doula. And whenever I say that, I have a couple of reactions. Someone either goes, oh, or what is that? And if you talk to many doulas, they often struggle to truly say what it is that we do for people at the end of life. So this is why I decided to undertake this as a study, is to actually get at the nitty-gritties of what we do, and especially from the perspectives of those who practice within this field. So this is where this research came from. It is an emerging role. So, you know, it has been around for centuries. This is not new care. It's usually done by the elderly women of the household. Caring for the dead took place at home, but it's now being reclaimed out of the healthcare system by professionals and also grassroots people who are saying, you know, this doesn't need to be as medicalized as it is. Institutions have their place, but we want to approach death a little bit more openly and naturally and not quite so disease-ridden. So this is where I think the struggle, it comes to explain what it is we do, because it's getting traction out there in the airwaves. But every time I listen to the description given to the reporter or when someone is interviewed, thinking, oh, that's not quite it. But then again, it's their words and not mine. And so we're all struggling to come to terms with that. So hence the phenomenological inquiry. And why a phenomenological inquiry? It basically is qualitative, and it's about stories, and it's about how things come to be, rather than jumping right in and trying to explain the way things happen. So it allows the researcher to take a step back and you know, in sort of come into the epoché, which was a Husserlian term, where you bracket or you suspend any preconceived opinions and you just watch the object or phenomenon being studied and see how it comes together. And the other reason why the phenomenological inquiry is so powerful is the language that can be used around it. It's grounded in those that are telling the stories. It's grounded in the descriptions of what happens when people are performing the doula role. And therefore, it hopefully will be more meaningful to those who perform it and also accessible to those who are learning about it for the first time. And that is essentially the goal of this research, is to increase the understanding of the role and the language around it to explain it, because again, it's hard to explain sometimes. So how did I do it? So basically there were 10 one-on-one interviews. Now, just as I had these interviews set up to do in person, but then the pandemic hit. And so there was a kind of a volte-face and we ended up doing a Zoom, which was interesting, but still very fruitful and rich. So it was an interesting experiment into itself and probably worthy of study by someone other than me. The interviews, because of Zoom, because of the format, tended to be 60 minutes. Once or twice I did phone back because someone just got tired or there were a couple of emotional times. I did use Amedeo Giorgi's phenomenological method. His method is based on Edmund Husserl and invokes the epoché, like I explained earlier. And it really puts the emphasis on the interviewees to describe events rather than try to interpret what they were going through. So, for example, when I was interviewing a couple of people, I would say, describe what is happening. And if they started going into, and I think this was, take a step back and don't worry about that, just give me the story. And in most of the cases, I gave them a photograph to look at, something they hadn't seen before, and asked them to describe as a doula how they saw what was happening in that photo, as a way of eliciting the story as opposed to any interpretation or any preconceived, this is what I was intending on doing. So that's key to this kind of inquiry. So, and it was, at the end when I asked my participants, they found it very freeing to not worry about being on the spot and having to explain themselves, but to just simply describe their love of their job and why they were doing it. So after this was done, I gathered all the interviews together, and as per Giorgi's method, I just did a whole read through the data, and just not worrying about just reading it, listening to the words, getting a sense of watching the videos, watching the physical movements, just sort of getting a sense of the data as a whole. Did this 3 or 4 times. So it was quite time consuming, but it was really interesting. After a while, you could start to see where the data sort of divided itself. And I started out, I think, with approximately 15 different sections. And then as I started revisiting it, the themes came out and interestingly enough, the things that delineated them were more of the transitive verbs. So I started delineating the data between providing for and being with a client, and then the clearing, which is a bigger section later. So it was really interesting to me. Again, it wasn't any particular phrase that delineated my themes. It was actually a kind of a verb or an action that did it for me. So there, in one slide, I've summarized up hours of work, but that is essentially the method that was used. So I then took some of the themes that came out of the research and framed them in Martin Heidegger's opus, one would say, Being and Time. Now, this was not an easy feat, and honestly, I'm at the point in my research, and Dr. Kisner can verify, where I'm really trying to do Heidegger justice, and it's a really difficult thing to do because his Being and Time is so full of language about being in the world and being with others, and this idea of human existence, and that we're the type of being that worries about our being. And so this plays into the themes of end-of-life care so well that it will be interplayed with some of my findings. So what ended up happening was I found basically 3 categories of care, which is what I've called them. They're very broad, but again, separated by the type of action being done by the doula. So by far the one that was easiest to describe were the practical tasks that doulas provide for someone who is dying, usually in response to something that they need, comfort, glass of water, so on. There's also the being present was the next level, which is where the doula provides comfort and distraction for the client if they're worried or concerned, and it's in the present. In fact, both practical tasks and being present are in the present. And then there was this really rich and something I'm really excited about concept of holding space. Now, the end-of-life doulas talked about holding space all the time. There's one of my favorite writers who's written a book called Holding Space, Amy Wright Glenn. But when you actually look at it, that not very many people could describe exactly what this meant. And look at the interviews and the data, you go back and you watch. When I asked, well, what does holding space mean? The conversation would dry up and people would be sort of trying to go, using hand gestures to go, well, you just hold the space. You can't describe it. You're just holding it. So it was really an interesting activity to then sort of probe and push a little further and get them to describe what was going on there. So these are the 3 categories that basically came out of the data. And now I'm just going to use these to intertwined with Heidegger to sort of explain how that works in an end-of-life care setting. So for Heidegger, when you are in the everydayness of life, you are walking through life and things take on significance and meaning when you encounter them and if they are handy to you at the time. So we will be going through life. For example, this coffee cup that you see on the slide is sitting on the table. It will always be it has been sitting on the table for a couple of hours, but until you suddenly think, oh, I need to refill my coffee cup, it isn't of significance to you until you encounter it. And this is everydayness. There's things going on all the time. Things are familiar. We're walking through the world. We're in the world with others. And things take on significance when you need something to do something. So in order to have a cup of coffee, I need a coffee cup. In order to provide comfort for my client, I need to bring them a glass of water or sit them up and chat with them for a while. So this is a very present, in the now kind of a feeling, and it's by far the easiest to describe. And I think it's for doulas, that is, because I think it's because it's something that you just do. And therefore, whenever you hear people trying to explain what doulas do, they say, oh, well, I provide comfort. I bring them, pillow. I fill out information for them. I do this, I do that. So the word do, and therefore I think in order to, are quite prevalent in this section of end-of-life care. So that's the first level of care that we'll talk about. I can time, but I'm kind of keeping an eye, and I get on a roll with this and I'm just going. So please feel free to interrupt me if you need to. The second category of care is that the being present. But in Heideggerian terms, he talks about, when we are in the world with each other, the world, the world that surrounds us, we are being with each other and we are entangled with each other in sort of everyday activities, and we go through life, some people would describe it as the busyness, the relationships we have with others, the even time itself, where we go to bed at a certain time, get up, we have tasks to do. But sometimes there isn't an actual tangible task for doulas. There is simply a being with a client that provides comfort of presence. And therefore, you're still entangled with the everyday world. So entanglement is another Heideggerian word, which means that you're caught up, you're fallen into the world that you are in, and we're tangled up with each other. We keep each other in the they, or we keep each other occupied with the world. And so for a doula, that's actually a way in which we provide comfort, is that by being with or being present with a client, we can honor their very existence. We can keep them comforted by singing or doing soothing activities. And they, in turn, can rest and retreat from what's worrying them. And we'll get to that in a second, by our presence and by the activities that they're doing with us. So, but this entanglement, however, can be tricky because it's a form of distraction, meaning that a lot of doulas say, well, you know, we want to make sure they're comfort, we want to make sure that everybody's happy and calm and relaxed and no one's upset. But as we'll see in the next section, what can happen is that if we remain too entangled, then we miss the opportunity for reflection about what our life has meant and what it could mean and what it is meaning at the time. So we miss an opportunity for time travel, in fact, which is kind of a fun way of looking at it. But it can also be, if you entangle yourself or you remain focused with those that are in the present, you don't get a chance to reflect on the individual, you as the individual who may be dying. And this leads me to my favorite part that has essentially taken over the research. So I started out wanting to just understand the doula role. And I fall in love with this concept. And so now like I said earlier, I'm trying to do it justice. But that idea of holding space that I talked about earlier, where people had a hard time understanding and describing what it is, I have interpreted as resonating with Heidegger's concept of the clearing. And a clearing is a place, and it can just be a glimpse. It doesn't have to be a place where you remain for long periods of time. But it allows for that exploration of time, of temporality, where you can appreciate what your life will have been, what your life has been, and it encompasses your entire lifetime. Now, something happens when you find out you're dying. So not all of us would be able to do this necessarily until something reinforces the idea that we're going to die. So we might be able to do this from time to time, but it is quite prevalent when someone finds out that their death is imminent. There is a lovely video series called The View from Here by Scott Burns. It's a documentary. I can give information later. And the first episode is Linda. And Linda says, you know, everyone knows they're dying. Everyone knows they're dying. But until you have that diagnosis, until you last winter, then you know you're really dying. And it's that really dying that's important here. And that's what actually is one of the foundations of creating this clearing, is that you're stepping out of the normal. You're stepping away from the everyday and the they, because no one else can die for you. And so it becomes a spot where you occupy, but the doula has helped you prepare you and set you up and holds this opportunity. So there's the holding space for you to then take that step. So for example, everything's put on hold. This is a time where there aren't any tasks going on. You kind of you try to ask for people not to disturb you at this time. This is a rich and exploring time of what life has meant to the client. And a doula is there simply to listen and to probe and to encourage that exploration. The interesting thing about this time frame is that not everything will suddenly be illuminated and you will be enlightened and everything will be fine. In fact, a lot of things will be very frightening. It will cause a ton of anxiety. But actually recognizing what's causing that anxiety and having some things remaining in the shadows, this is what I kind of like about this image, is that you'll come to terms with some things, but then whatever you're turning away from. So Heidegger was clear that whatever you're turning away from actually it is then that the nature of that will be clear to you, because you'll be turning away from it. And in that turning away, be like, oh, I don't like that because, and its nature will also be manifested that way. So when we come into this clearing and we're looking around, we may see things that are suddenly much more plain and understood. But I would argue there's a richness in still exploring some of the things that people are scared to go and explore. So this is, as you can probably tell, hopefully this has just been, to me, an revelatory, because this, I think, is the heart and soul of the doula work. And yet this is the hardest thing to explain, most difficult thing to explain. And so to find Heidegger's ideas of fallenness and how we can come back around to ourselves through this avoidance of what he calls the possibility of the impossibility of not being anymore, which sounds convoluted, but it really is in the turning away from things that we understand them. So yeah, that's the clearing. And again, I'm at the point where at my research paper where I'm rewriting this section, trying to truly flesh this out and do justice to Heidegger's thought. So as you can see from my book, I've got so many things highlighted, and it's quite the thing. So that's the clearing. So really now, when we are looking at doula care, it is multi-layered. And I think the practical tasks are the ones that are most understood. And then there are those that it increases in depth as you come towards that holding space and bring clients into the clearing. And I see a question, differences based on those who've been terminally ill. That's an excellent question. And actually, from what I've understood from the stories, there really isn't, there's a difference in the practical tasks and the being present. But with a skilled doula, the holding space, it is actually a question of how many times or how often you're allowed to go there. So I think someone who has been terminally ill for a long time, there will be this interweaving of sometimes you're facing it, and sometimes the entanglement rears up and things, the new normal happens, especially if an illness plateaus, for example. And we've seen clients who for a while just forget that they're dying, and then of course when something changes in their illness, then suddenly there's a revisiting of that space and they go into it again. Someone with an unexpected death with very short timelines would maybe not even have a chance to go into the space, but if they can, it's because a doula has been brought in, or they have an extremely skilled chaplain or healthcare team. So I'm not, it doesn't have to be a doula, although it tends to be. And with sudden and unexpected deaths, of course, it just would depend on the access of people to get you into that mindset, if that makes sense. I hope that answered your question. So I guess there is a difference, isn't there, now that I've talked myself around in a circle, that the people who have been terminally ill for some time have more chance to explore the life that they have lived. So those are the three the layers of care, which I'm now hoping to go out into the field, communicate and get doulas talking about, because again, practical tasks, really easy to explain. Being present, yep, actually most people can say, I'm there, I comfort and I soothe. So where I'm really going to focus on is the holding space, the bringing clients into the clearing. Because I think there's so many powerful metaphors and images, that I've used here, but that are out there that could explain that concept. So I'm really excited about this. This gets, okay. Out of this, of course, came a whole other desire to do a whole other MAIS degree. So if anybody's there wondering whether they would like to do another MAIS degree, please see me. I can't do two. According to Dr. Kisner, I can't do two. But there are some things that I would like to go further in, obviously, and that is this pandemic era notion of being with. The fact that most doulas have approached being with the client in person, but we're seeing more and more people shifting and being with the client online. And as most of you know, in some cases, it can be really quite powerful. And the idea that we may have to use some interesting kind of technology or online platforms to be with each other is definitely an area I'd like to explore. There's also applied projects of that kind of thing for teaching of compassion, especially online teaching, because again, I had to pivot my in-person instruction to online, and trying to come up with ways of allowing people to explore a very compassionate role has been challenging. So this study came from the perspective of the end-of-life doulas, but obviously it would be lovely to have the families of loved ones who have employed doulas to ask them similar questions and how they saw the role and how it benefited them. And then where I tend to be leaning, depends on where I can go, is a focus study on this nature of the clearing and what exactly it does for clients and their loved ones. So that is these are some of the directions. And so that brings me to the end. I'm sitting at 2:28. Sorry, it's a little bit over time, but I do want to thank the 10 participants. I'm just waiting on some consents to make sure I can list them by name. And of course, Dr. Kisner, you're here. Thank you for giving me the push, because you did, into doing this from a phenomenological perspective. And OGSA, end-of-life colleagues who support me while I've been doing this, and of course, my clients. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. So I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. I see one from Anne, I think. Are you on mute, Anne? I can't hear you.
Yes, I am. Okay, I wanted to know, from a perspective as a fellow artist, have you used any art at all in your doula practice?
Yes, I have. And I do know that there are many doulas who do. Not everyone does. Some people do ritual. I had one client where their family was struggling and they were quite a creative family. So I asked them we do art to get those emotions out on the table. Yeah, for sure. And it's a very rich experience. But I'm not an art therapist, so I tread very carefully. But if they were open to it, and certainly it was rich for all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not an art therapist either. I'm an appreciation of art therapy, as I've done it myself, had taken part in it. But I wanted to know if, you had done the association of art activities. Thank you.
Very much. Thanks for your question. Would I consider the clearing to be a process of individuation? Yes, I think that's that is very much a point where, and Heidegger references this too, and I'm going to do him disservice here, where it's truly an understanding it's an authentic understanding of your position in the world in a way where you're not caught up in the they and, simplistically summed up as no one can die for you. They can be there while you're dying, but your death is uniquely your own, and it is the final possibility. So absolutely, yeah, individuation, definitely. I would say the ultimate individuation, to be honest, because it's the final possibility. So the strengths and limits of using Heidegger in theorizing compassion. I think there will be better experts at Heidegger than myself when it comes to compassion. I think in this context, the way that I've seen compassion play out is more in the sense of this holding space where doulas, instead of trying to control or direct or show compassion, they actually are just being compassion by creating and holding the space for someone to step into the clearing. And I think that's where I would argue, and maybe Dr. Kisner could to jump in, but I would say compassion I found more when I got into Levinas and Merleau-Ponty. I sort of found there was more dealings with compassion, but Heidegger was, I would say, much more along the lines of individuation, if that makes sense. So that's my very graceful way of saying that's an excellent question, and I just don't think I have a complete answer. And cultural differences are touching and comforting the dying. Very much so. And one thing that I haven't put in here, and thank you for the reminder, is that there are some, limitations to well, it's not really a limitation, but I found the population of study is very, it's not diverse at all, very monocultural, basically middle-aged white women like myself. And so we tend to have we tend to have clients that reflect our ethnicity. And it's also quite elitist in the sense that right now it's paid for rather than unless you're a volunteer. So again, only a certain socioeconomic status can afford it. And that to me is the limits. This is one of the limits to the role, is how do we establish its value so that it can be extended beyond where it is now. And so therefore, yes, I've definitely come up against cultural differences, but I would argue it would be my experience as a care aide, to be honest, more than doula. So I have been a healthcare aide for several years, and that's where definitely touching and comforting the dying is very personal and cultural. And even talking about death is personal and cultural. We tend to be still very death phobic, whereas some cultures are all about grieving and emotions being at the surface. So absolutely, that might actually be another great research project. So I hope I've carried off most of the questions here. Before we finish our time, is there any other questions?
I just like to make a quick comment, not really a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marianne. This is a great presentation. I really, am interested in the way the three categories, when you describe the three categories of the doula role, the first two, dealing with the handiness and being present, those could be, seems to me those could be equally applied to a number of other kinds of caregivers, but you really get into the specificity of the doula role with that holding space and entering the clearing. And what's also interesting to me from a Heideggerian perspective is it often, I mean, Heidegger's been criticized for this too, of sort of neglecting the actual world, the actual socio-political world in favor of this rarefied notion of the clearing and authenticity and such. And when you read Heidegger, I mean, sometimes you can get that impression, but then if something that always stuck with me in reading Heidegger's Being and Time is that what he calls authenticity, Eigentlich, right, this proper sense of being towards one's own mortality and recognizing the kind of being that you are, is actually, he says, is a modification of that inauthentic everyday entanglement. So we're always just kind of modifying that to get into that clearing. And you're research really brings that out, because one of the things that came through to me in your project is that there's this positive aspect of entanglement, right? That the clients need this respite. You can't live in full on being toward death constantly every day, right? So it's always going to be a modification of that entanglement that you enter into the clearing, these moments. And I think it's why Heidegger used the term Augenblick, right? This kind of moment of insight that you have. And so anyway, that's just a comment. I thought it was really well done and really good work, Mary Ann. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, he's an interesting, he's I found the whole, this is why I struggle so much with the compassion question. It's a very good one. Is that because I think he's so focused on that individuation and that sort of your, falling away and falling into the they, that, being in time, given that it was so expansive, he really does focus a great deal on just that. What does it mean to be a sentient being worried about its own existence? And so therefore it is really quite, I hate to use the word, it's quite selfish, isn't it? Because you're looking at yourself all the time and you aren't necessarily, worried about others, but yet you're completely entangled. And the other thing about the doula work, yes, is I see it as a cycle. I wish there was some way of showing that. I couldn't do a slide that did it justice, where I think, when you look at the 3 categories of care, they're going on all the time in varying degrees. And it has to, because eventually you could be having a deep, soulful chat, but you're going to have to eat because you get hungry. So there's always going to be some interruptions. And I also love the concept of the Augenblick, that moment of startling insight, because it can be very disconcerting. And the first reaction is to run away and say, oh. And that's why I also love the images where you don't always see everything, because it would be overwhelming if you did.
Oh yeah, and the clearing is always premised on, the unconcealment of the clearing is always premised on concealment throughout Heidegger, right? You don't have unconcealment without concealment.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always that withdrawal back into concealment. You never get away from that.
Yeah, anyway, I know I'm looking at Anita's comments about living us. I know this is the rabbit hole that I'm now down, because, and it's, Dr. Kisner, it's all your fault anyway. And it's because it's you start, sort of creating this one level of understanding, and I'm like, oh, right, but then this and this. So I agree, this could go in so many directions, and yeah. I haven't even focused on anybody other than Heidegger. Husserl a little bit in the methodology, and I really also enjoyed Merleau-Ponty. But I read one book on Levinas and went, I can't go there. It's too much.
Thank you.
Anyway, I think
you've done a hell of a lot by taking on being in time without.
Yeah.
That's really quite an achievement right there.
Thank you. It feels like it sometimes. Some days I want to fling it across the wall, and other days I'm like absorbed.
Oh yeah, I know that.
Anyway, it is 20 to 3, so I'm hoping that people are feeling like I'm done and that they can feel free to leave. But this has been an absolute joy. I'm so glad to have the chance to share. So thank you again for being here. Thanks,
Mary Ann, for sharing. And for presenting this research. I have heard you talk before, and at the conferences in the past, and I've always really enjoyed your research. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, very much appreciated, and for pulling this together, Crystal.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Yes, have a great day, everyone. See you online somewhere.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.